Let's build this thing. First connection is pulse wave from my primary oscillator, in this case the Trident, into a low-pass filter. I'm using the WMD Carbon, which has a really nice 2-pole low-pass output. Patch the filter's output into a VCA. I'll use Vales 3 for this. You'll notice I'm using a longer cable than it looks like is necessary. For simpler patches, I like to keep the cable short so that the connections between patch points are a little easier to see. But for this patch, we're using a lot of cables, and I want to keep the panel as clean as possible so I have access to the controls and so that you can see what I'm doing on camera. So when I can, I'll just route these out of the way off camera. Patch the output of this VCA into my mixer. Open up the filter. The next step is to animate it. I'll use an envelope from Quadrax. I'll take the output of envelope 2, run it into the filter's FM input, which is scaled by this middle knob here, and I will mult that envelope to the CV input on this VCA, which now will silence it because the envelope isn't moving. To make this envelope begin to move, I'll clock it with this module. This is Pamela's new workout, and that is the last time I will say the name of this module during this episode. If you've ever been to IHOP and had your eye on the Rudy Tooty Fresh and Fruity, but you didn't want it bad enough to have to say it out loud, you understand my position. From here on out, you are the unipolar clocked shape generator, and that can take a lot of forms. It can be a clock multiplier, a clock divider, a Euclidean pattern generator, a unipolar LFO, a stepped or smooth random voltage generator. It can do a lot of things. I just want a stream of gates at 16th notes. So I'll set channel 8, the modifier, to ×4, and patch channel 8 to the trigger input of envelope 2. Now my next move will be to animate the pitch of this voice, and I'll also use the shape generator for that. I'll go to channel 1, I'll set the modifier to divide by 4, which gives us a pattern length of 1 bar. Go into the submenu, change it to a triangle wave shape. We'll use that in just a minute. I'm going to feed several voltages through this noise engineering attenuverting mixer. So I'll patch the output of the CV mixer into the CV input of my Ornament and Crime, which today is running Quadraturia quad sample and hold with quantizing. I almost always run that app. I very seldom change modes on this. And this sample and hold is going to need a trigger in too, isn't it? So I'll mult the gate that's triggering the envelope and use it to fire the sample and hold. The way I have it set up, channel 1 triggers all 4 channels. Channels 2, 3, and 4 are generating random values with the Turing machine function, and channel 1 is waiting for a CV input. This is a pretty common setup for me. I think I've had it this way in the last 2 videos as well. I'll take the output of this sample and hold and patch it into the volt per octave input on my primary oscillator. On this CV mixer, if nothing is patched into channel 1, it's normal to an offset, so you get 5 volts positive, 5 volts negative. I'll open up the filter and see what that gives us. Cool, this all looks familiar. The next move is to patch the hill shape that we just made, this slowly moving triangle, into channel 2. Now would be a great time to activate the quantizer on this module. This process can be really fun. You can go through all the different scales and choose one that sounds good to you. I think I wound up using a Locrian scale the last time I worked through this patch, with the first 4 notes of the scale active and the remaining 3 masked off. So now we have a cycling 1-bar hill shape to our sequence that can be scaled and offset. And it'll always snap to the closest note in this scale, so it'll always be in key. Now to add a little more variation to this sequence, I want another shape, spikes. So I'll take channel 5, change the modifier to be ×2, and to thin it out, I'll make it a Euclidean sequence. How about an 8-step sequence with 2 triggers? We'll see what that gives us. Patch it into channel 3. I'll unpatch the hill shape just so we can isolate what channel 5 is doing for us. It gives us 2 short jumps every bar. One thing I'll be thinking about here is, what is the usable range? How much of a jump am I realistically going to want? Let's say that the maximum would be 3 octaves. Well, if 100% is 5 volts out of here, let's go to 60%. So now we have a little more fine control over the range of this jump. I'll reconnect the hill shape, combine them all. That sounds great, but I want to thin out the density of these hills. I want one to happen every 4 bars, and the way we thin out the density of events on here is to turn it into a Euclidean pattern. I'll make this a 4-step pattern with 1 trigger. 1. Perfect, so we have 3 bars where nothing happens, and then 1 bar where we get that hill shape. And that is basically the sequence. I love the fact that we can scale it and offset it. Next up, let's bring in some time-based effects, reverb and delay. I like to bring these types of effects into a patch as early as possible by extending what might be small events like the transient of an attack and extending them in the time domain. It can illuminate interesting textural things that are going on with our sound that we might not otherwise be aware of. So I will grab this bass on its way from the VCA to the main mix, put in a mult and send it to the delay. Route the delay's output to the reverb's input, and route the reverb's output to channel 4 of the mix. So I'll turn the delay to fully dry, turn the reverb to fully wet, open up channel 4 and see what we've got. Now, whenever you're routing a delay and a reverb in series, there's always the question of which comes first. And as you might guess, the answer depends a lot on what you're trying to achieve. There are a couple of reasons why I've routed the delay before the reverb in this patch. This delay, if I turn it fully wet, will act as a pre-delay for this reverb. Let's hear how that sounds. So we hear the reverb coming in quite a ways behind the dry sound. And one thing a pre-delay can be really useful for is when the delay between the dry sound and the wet sound is longer, it tricks our brain into thinking that the space we're in is larger or that the sound is farther away. It creates more of a separation between the foreground and the background. And one characteristic of this delay, this is an analog bucket brigade delay, which tends to really degrade the signal. And the longer the decay is, the more it degrades the signal. The more lo-fi it is, the less high frequency content it has. And I'm using that to my advantage here. When I dial up a long pre-delay, it's also kind of acting as a mellow bandpass filter with a lot of character. So it's thinning out the signal before it hits the reverb, which lets me get away with this long decay time on a fast track because it's so swampy and buried. And before I go too much farther, I'd like to clock this delay because it does have a sync input. Come up to channel 3 here and set the modifier to multiply by 1.3. Route this cable up and into the sync input. And now instead of milliseconds, we're looking at divisions of the incoming clock. I'll divide the incoming clock by 2. We'll hear everything is nicely tempo synced now. Getting some nice crunch out of this Veils too. And I haven't had this thing very long. When I got it, I guess I expected it would be more clean, and it's been a pleasant surprise to find that it has this really nice saturation to it, especially when you dial the response more towards the exponential side. I think my favorite thing about putting the delay before the spring in this patch is when I back off the delay mix, it sends some of the dry signal to the tank, which makes this knob work like a reverb send. And you still get the pre-delay, so you hear the reverb up front, and then the echoes of it. And as long as we're here, I'm going to automate that. Let's take advantage of a shape that we already have going. I know I like the sound of that dense reverb on the rise at the end of our 4-bar phrase. And since we already have a CV shape making that rise, let's just apply it to automate that effect. So I'll quickly mold that hill shape, run it into an attenuverter, invert it so that now instead of giving us a rise, it's giving a dip. And I'll take that dip and apply that to the mix CV, and we'll hear what happens on the next pass of the sequence. That's automation in a modular. We need a kick drum. I'll turn off sync and track on the second oscillator here so that it can do its own thing. We'll leave it on a triangle wave. Triangle wave gets patched into a VCA. I'm using this WMD SSF amplitude because it has a really nice saturation circuit on it that sounds great on a kick drum. Then the VCA's output goes directly to our mix, channel 1. Bring up the fader, open up the VCA. And with this VCA, listen to what happens to the high frequency content of the signal when I bring up the saturation. It's interesting. There's a sweet spot in there about halfway up where it really starts to almost filter out a lot of the high-end energy, and then it brings in a new sort of character in the top half of the knob's range. Let's bring down the frequency of the oscillator. Now it's subtle, but it's going to be really important when we start to animate it with an envelope. I'll bring down the offset to quiet this thing up. Start my shape maker going again, and I'll use channel 4 just as I found it, with a modifier of 1x, and I'll use it to trigger envelope number 1. Envelope 1's output will be pointed at the amplifier's CV input. Turn it up and see what that does. That's kind of a kick drum, but it does need some thump, so we'll mult this envelope to the exponential FM input on our kick drum's oscillator. Use a very long cable for this. Bring up the index and see what we get. So 3 parameters, the envelope's shape, the envelope's fall time, and the FM index are going to be the primary ways that we shape the impact of this kick. The amount of CV into the VCA and the gain and saturation are also going to have a pretty big effect. So it's nice and punchy, but I want some sustain. So for a quick and dirty way of doing that, I'll just turn up the offset on the VCA. Oh, that sounds mean. Let's bring back the bass. Bring back some of the kick sustain. Yeah, bad tuning. So the frequency of the kick in a track like this is really important for defining the sort of energy and the feel of the thing. If it's too high, it'll sound kind of weedy and annoying. If it's too subby, it won't have enough punch. I'll start by tuning the kick, and then I'll tune the bass to the kick. Sometimes it helps me to make the wave a little brighter, just so you can actually hear the pitch. It's a little flat. So that kick's sitting pretty well. I'll leave it alone for a little while. Now to make this voice sound a little more interesting and a little more alive, I want to randomize some parameters. And some of my favorite parameters are the envelope's decay time, the filter's cutoff, and the filter's resonance. So we just go through and sort of try things by moving the knobs, and I think of that as a sort of audition. If we like what it sounds like in the audition, we can automate it. Let's grab some random values out of the sample and hold. Channel B, route it down and around the long way to the input of channel 1 on the Tangled Quartet. Patch that attenuated random value to the envelope's decay CV. See what that does. Alright, next up we'll tap another stepped random out of channel C and route it to the input of another VCA. That attenuated random value will patch to the filter's volt per octave input. Let's see what we get. You see what I mean about how it's worthwhile to have the delay and reverb patched up early? There's some complexity emerging from these random things that I don't think would really be apparent if we didn't have the long tail reflecting those changes back at us. And the last modulation I want will not actually be random, it will be periodic, so we'll come back to pull another shape. Go to channel 7, set the modifier to multiply by 2, and to make sure this happens at a different place in every bar and sort of moves around on us, I'll make this a Euclidean pattern, let's say 5 steps long with 1 trigger, running at 2x, which means eighth notes, which means we'll have 4 eighth notes that are flat and then 1 that is spiked. And that shape goes to another VCA. Again, these aren't being used as VCAs, I'm just using these as attenuators with nice knobs in this patch. And that attenuated shape, I'll patch to my filter's resonance CV. I'll bring up the FM from the envelope and see what this does. That one really wakes up the spring. So it spikes the resonance in a predictable way. To make it a little less predictable, a little more odd, maybe I'll change the length of this sequence. I'll do 11 steps with, let's say, 2 triggers. I like that, it feels a little bit lurching. So our bass now has a ton of performance controls. We have all the sequencing controls, we have the offset, we have the scaling, we have the filter cutoff, the filter envelope amount, we have the resonance, we have the decay time, and we have these handy, easy to get at controls for sending CV modulation to envelope decay, filter cutoff, and resonance. Now that I've got an interesting pattern going that I like, I might try to start modulating the oscillator's tone. Pulse width. Try a sawtooth. I think I like the pulse better. Now if you have a wavetable oscillator or something like that that allows you to spice up the tone, now would be a great time to play with that. I'm going to use something called Zing Mod on this oscillator. I guess it's sort of like Ring Mod. It's pretty tasty. It uses oscillators 2 and 3 to modulate oscillator 1. Alright, where's that kick? When I bring up the sustain portion of the kick, it has a pitch, and it wants to share space with the bottom end of the bass, so things get muddy. There's frequency masking going on. The bass line also feels pretty static here, so let's touch on both these issues with a ducking effect, where the kick sort of shoves the bass out of the way. Traditionally, this was done by putting a compressor on the bass and using the kick drum as a key or a sidechain signal. This is how we get that hyped up pumping on the offbeat sound, and it can be a problem solver or a creative effect or a terrible crutch depending on how you use it and who's giving you mix notes. I don't have a compressor here, but I do have some flexible CV shapes and a bunch of VCAs, and since this kick is 4 on the floor, we should be able to fake it pretty convincingly. Go to channel 6, that's not patched to anything. And right now, channel 6, I don't know if you can see it on camera here, but it's identical to channel 4. It has a 50% duty cycle gate at a quarter note. What I'm going to do is change the phase of that. Take our phase parameter here and offset it by 50%, so that now when the kick gate is high, this other gate is low and vice versa. So they're doing this. Now in order to pull this trick off, I need to patch another VCA in between my bass and the mixer. So let's do that. Channel 4. This is also kind of neat because it then gives us 2 stages of overdrive if we want that. We'll route this gate down to the CV input of our most recently added VCA. I'm going to keep my cables tidy. Well, we're getting there, but it sounds pretty obnoxious, doesn't it? I can ignore the clicking for a second and just make an adjustment between the off state and the on state. And I'll do that by adding an offset that brings the off state up just a little bit so it doesn't fully silence it when the gate hits. That clicking sound is no good. It might not be an issue if the bass sound we're using is really bright, because the extra high frequencies might mask the click. But it's driving me a little bit nuts, so let's find another way to approach this. Let's find a different shape, a smoother shape. I'm going to switch this to a triangle wave, and I want to make a few modifications to it. I'm going to bring down the width a little bit to say 35%. And adjust the phase so that it occurs a little earlier in the cycle. Let's put the phase at 80%. Here what that gives us. So instead of a clicky on-off gate, we get more of a push and a pull. Talk about this kick drum. Because of the cyclical nature of this thing, it sounds like this kick drum just has a long sustain or decay or whatever, which is true. It's actually infinite. We can stop it and it continues to sustain because the offset is open. What I would like to add is a proper decay stage to this envelope. And this is probably the coolest thing that I've discovered in the process of working on this patch. Bring in the kick. I'm going to pull the kick from the mix and patch it through another VCA and patch the output of that VCA back into the mixer. Open it up, and we're just as we were, but we have another VCA in the signal path. Now this VCA needs a control voltage to open and close it, and for that I'm going to tap into the gate that's triggering our kick's envelope. Put in a stackable here so I can mult the signal. Take that mult, and that is now our CV for our second VCA. Now it sounds like we have an attack, and a decay, and a sustain, and an immediate, very clicky and unpleasant release. So we have control over the attack and the decay. So I guess this third stage here, it's not exactly, it is a sustain, but it has a finite time value on it, which means it's not quite a sustain, because sustain is usually defined as a level, not as a time. It's more like a hold phase that follows the decay. And what I want to do is add a little bit of a release onto the end of that hold. And the way I'm going to do that is by patching the CV through a slew limiter. I told you this would get messy. I don't know what I'd do without these twist ties. Oh, that's cool. And the slew limiter's output, I'll patch back into the amplifier's CV. So as I adjust the fall time, there's the final stage. We get a nice chunky kick and all the parameters from the attack, the decay, the sort of hold phase, and then the release. We have control over all of them. The only thing is, since this is a 50% duty cycle pulse, we can't make the hold stage any shorter than that. So I'm going to shorten up the pulse a little bit. Go to our channel 4 menu. I'll turn the width from 50% and I'll start bringing it down. 40, 30, 20, 10. And I'll leave it at 12. Adjust the fall time on the slew limiter. Now, one really cool happy accident that I came across here was I didn't think about what would happen if I started playing with the rise time on the slew limiter. Let's find out. Turn it up a little bit and the kick completely goes away. Hear it start to come in. Because it's applying a slew to the rising edge of the gate as well, which is where the attack portion of the kick happens. Really interesting relationship between these things. It's not like a traditional envelope at all, but what this does is it gives us a cool way to mute the kick. What I'm going to use for that is a module I haven't used yet in the series before. It's this ADAC floor control, and it's just connected to two pedals on the floor. One of them is an expression pedal, like a Moog rocker switch thing, and the other is just a sustain pedal. You could probably DIY this with a 9-volt battery. If I'd thought of it, maybe I would have done that too. I'll patch into the gate out that's generated by my sustain pedal and run it into the rise time CV. Now, when I press my foot switch, the kick goes away. It has an interesting little fade out, which I'm not really mad at. I can adjust the parameters here so that I get less of that. All right, let's bring the bass back in. Okay, moving along. Next up, hi-hats. Noise is an excellent source for hi-hats, and I have a great noise source here in this MCO. Grab an output there, and I'll patch it into my 3-tom MS-22, which is a good choice for this because it has a low-pass and a high-pass filter. They're in series. It has really strong resonance. It's a really colorful filter, and it'll let us sculpt the noise just how we want it so it fits in the mix. The filter's output, I'll patch into a VCA. Use channel 2 of Veils, and the VCA's output goes to channel 3 in the mixer. I love that digital downsampled noise. And as long as we're here, let's get some audio rate FM into the filter. I'll patch into the triangle wave output of my bass oscillator, run it into the filter CV input on the MS-22. Now this is cool. We can actually hear the imprint of the bass upon this noise now because the bass oscillator is being used to modulate the filter's frequency. I really like that. We'll leave it unmodulated for the time being. Now, since I want my hi-hats to be playing a 16th note pattern, and I already have a perfectly good 16th note pattern triggering my sample and hold and my bass envelope, it is not broke. I will not fix it. I will take that same signal and use it to trigger channel 3 of my quadracs. We have another envelope going. And the output, envelope 3, I'll patch into the CV input of the VCA that's controlling our noise. The low pass, High pass. Resonance. Oh, that gets dirty. Bring in some of that frequency modulation we played with earlier. Oh, that's pretty static. I want something that sounds more like... Here's where the sequencer comes in. This sequencer is a weird one. I'd like to do some more videos about this specifically down the road, but right now I'm just going to dial up a 16-step sequence real quick. Go to track 1, click step, insert a step, zero out the CVs, set the duration to 1, set the gate to 1, and then tap the insert button 15 times until I have 16 steps. Then the sequencer needs a clock, and since I already have a quarter note from my bass gate going through this slew limiter, I will just grab a mult there, run it to my clock input, go to the track settings, have it multiply the clock by 4, unpause it, and start the sequence. Great, we can see the numbers are counting up and it looks like 16ths. So I'll go through this step by step. Patch that pattern I just made into the envelope's decay time, bundling it up with the other cables so it doesn't get lonely. Edit a few steps here. All right, that's not bad. It has a little motion to it. All right, now I'm going to experiment with this oscillator. Maybe try a few sources that aren't noise, play with the frequency, make some adjustments to the filter settings, see where it takes us. Let's automate it. I have one more shape left. Set the modifier to divide by 4. Make the wave shape a triangle. I'll make the width 0. That'll just give us a down-sloping wave that lasts for a bar. Actually, I'll change that. I'll make it last for 2 bars. Set the modifier to divide by 8. Patch that shape down to our last VCA. That's 9 VCAs, folks. And that VCA's output goes to the volt per octave input on this oscillator. Crank it up, see what we get. You know what, I just realized something. I want some reverb on these hi-hats, and I also think that it would be nice if they ducked the kick like the bass is doing. And there's a really simple way to do that. Since this Veils has a cascading mixer, all I need to do, since these are on adjacent channels, is pull out the output from the channel that my hats are running through, and now it's submixed with the bass on channel 2. So I can bring fader number 3 down all the way and see what we get.